Welcome. I am Marianne Waite, Director of Inclusive Design at Interbrand. And for those of you who can't see me, I'm a white cisgender female with long brown hair and a rather loud shirt on to get me in the mood. Pink and green flowers, my two favourite colours. And I'm delighted to be joined by such a fantastic panel today. Before we begin, I just want to mention that this session is pre-recorded. So although we won't have time for a Q&A today, hopefully we'll be able to squeeze in enough chat and cover enough ground ourselves that you'll find it enlightening enough. The All In Census findings show that people with disabilities in our industry are underrepresented, just 9% versus 20% of the working population. And disability experience is poor across the board, with twice as many people likely to leave their organisations compared to the national average. So it's really clear that action needs to be taken to improve both the experience and representation of disabled talent, both off-screen and on-screen. So to discuss this in greater detail, I'd like to welcome our panellists. Josh Loebner from across the pond, who is Director of Strategy, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Designsensory. Samantha Renke, actress and disability activist. You'll recognise her potentially from the Maltesers advert and from her column in the London Metro. And Mike Alhadeff, Senior Strategist at AMV BBDO.
Hi.
Hi,
thanks so much.
Nice to be here.
Yay! So I'm going to start off with a question to Mike, because Mike works within the advertising industry over here in the UK. So I'm sure we'll have some great insights to share with us. Now, Mike, you recently wrote a brilliant article for Campaign magazine, and you mentioned within that article that the disabled community in the UK has an estimated spending power of £5.8 trillion a year. But as we know, very little is being done at the moment to make both products and experiences accessible for this market. So, as someone in the know, what do you think companies should be doing to enact change, and how do you think they could start to improve?
So firstly, obviously, there's a lot of money that we're talking about. So it's something that companies should actually be tapping into. But obviously, there's a very big market that are not there. I think why companies haven't done it so far is, to be quite blunt, it hasn't really been on their agenda. So they haven't really thought about it, but obviously if you dangle that massive carrot in front of them, then they might start thinking about it. Obviously they can start thinking about it if they employ more diverse people, because if they have more diverse people, they might start to think about these challenges a bit more. I think another reason they can think about it is, as I mentioned in the campaign article that I wrote, is that a lot of these changes don't need to be that big, that they can be small, everyday changes that people don't necessarily think about because they haven't encountered those. So that's sliced bagels or kind of pregnancy tests for visually impaired people. These are everyday hacks that really don't require a little hard work to get over the line.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes it can feel a little bit intimidating. You know, we might think that we have to do huge, big things in order to include the perspective of people with disabilities. But you're totally right, and that quite often small but consistent changes are what's required. I think what's so exciting about the opportunity for the advertising agency is that really representation is so important in terms of broadening the minds of the masses and making people much more comfortable with disability, because we don't like to say it, but a lot of people still are very awkward and still are potentially too overcome by fear to properly make the right changes. But to your point and to your experience, in order to get that on-screen representation correct, we need the right perspectives within organizations. And I think a lot of the time there's a lot of talk about it. People are very comfortable talking about why this is so important, but it's the how and the what. So in terms of making those changes, whether they're big or small, what do you think agencies should be doing to make sure that we have the right off-screen representation?
I think obviously importantly is a conversation with clients, so to put it on their agenda. And I think within that conversation, as you mentioned, it's quite easy to be vague and throw out a lot of nice words, but I think it's understanding your client's business and understanding where inclusive designs can play a role. And again, I keep going back to this. I think it's good to start small and then aim big. So find the small wins in your client's business. Start with that rather than promising the world and then under-delivering. So, and then once hopefully you get a few case studies on the board, then it'll make it easier to have other conversations with clients, and therefore you get a very easy kind of multiplier effect where people see success, people see greater representation, and most importantly, they see the bottom line growing, and therefore other clients and other new pitches will go, oh, we want some of that because it's clearly working. I think once you show it works, then there's very little debate or argument to be had.
Yeah, you're totally right. What I find really interesting, and this leads really nicely onto a question I've got for you, Sam, is Maltesers is still heralded as a great example, which it was, of disability representation. It was funny, it was pithy, it was accurate, it was helpful. But that was what, like 4 years ago now? 4 or 5 years ago. And actually, if you ask people in the last few years what tops that, or what other examples can you think of, they really struggle to think of anything. So, you know, if you were to apply that to, say, gender or race, when was the last time you saw a great representation of a woman in an advert? Oh, 5 years ago. People would be outraged. So I'm going to talk a little bit about your experience with Mars, because what they did was incredible, really, just by doing something very small, like including the perspective of disabled people. So what was the experience like for you working on this campaign? And what do you think advertisers can learn from this to help normalize disability through advertising?
I think I want to just, first of all, echo everything that's already been said. I think we still feel very uncomfortable around disability. And, you know, me as a campaigner and a broadcaster and someone who is very much in a privileged position in the sense that I do get regular work on TV. In comparison with my non-disabled peers, it's probably diminished, you know, quite considerably. But as a disabled woman, I am very, very fortunate. But we are. I think some people look at disabled people and think, oh my goodness me, I don't want to ever think about being ill health or disabled. I mean, I literally had a friend of mine tell me the other day, if I was in a car crash tomorrow, I'd rather die. You know, so this is very much a reality of how we see disabled people. We still don't, the society, recognise that we have systemic ableism. Most people in the street don't even know what the word ableism or disableism is, let alone use it in a sentence. You know, so I think, first of all, we actually need to be very upfront and say that disabled people are so marginalised across the board, and COVID has absolutely highlighted this. You know, I'm going off on a tangent, but, you know, if we look at how many deaths were disabled people during the pandemic, you know, it was 60% of deaths, you know. So if we look at that on how day-to-day life is for someone with a disability, how can we then say, you know, expect us to have such a strong platform on screen? For me, it was 4 years ago. It was, the Maltese advert, which is crazy, which reminds me that I'm getting older. And that's why I bought another cat, which you can probably hear in the background. I do apologise. I'm now a cat lady and darn proud. But, you know, it was amazing as an actress for me. You know, it was quite funny because a lot of people just thought that I'm a wheelchair user, and someone just grabbed me off the street and went, "You'll do," for this advert. But no, I actually went for a lot of auditions, got callbacks. I did I did a proper job, you know. I was at the kind of research board as well, even before I even got, invited for an interview. I think it was pioneering because for me, I got to show my sassy side, and which is a very authentic representation of who I am. And I was able, in the actual process, to change some of the script. So, you know, that was quite authentic. You know, it wasn't non-disabled people going, I think a disabled person would say this. And this is very much, this should be the essence of how we approach disability. You know, don't speak for disabled people. If you want to represent us, let us have our voice. So I think that was absolutely, that merits its success. And also the way people approached me afterward. There was, for I would say, close to 2 years, I couldn't leave my home without someone wanting a selfie, or some guy in a white van rolling down the window going, "Oi, yay, Maltesers!" People still think that I carry Maltesers around with me. As I just go about my daily business, and they're absolutely mortified when I say no. And also people think that I got paid in Maltese. I was like, no, I got paid in cash, like a proper, not cash, that sounds dodgy, doesn't it? No, not cash, it went through my agent and everything. Don't worry, I'm not trying to avoid tax. So it was digging myself here into a little hole. So it was a great experience for me, because I was no longer the girl in the wheelchair. I was this funny, sassy northern lass with blonde hair who ran off with the best man. And I think that's what was beautiful. All of a sudden, I went from being other as a disabled person to just someone that pops up in people's living rooms and made them chuckle. So I think that's why it was successful. A lot of people wanted me to do like a sequel to it, like the Nescafe adverts, which I was always up for. Like, you can give me a call if you want to, kind of take that forward. But, I think the success was, you could tell it came from disabled people. It was their story, and it wasn't a negative, stereotypical view of disability.
That's actually, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of really interesting points that you made. Number one is this idea of not speaking for disabled people, which is a pitfall we see quite a lot. And I think it's easy for brands or for corporates to fall into this idea or this role of corporate savior. We can swoop in and save the day. And actually, that's not what we're angling for here. What we're looking for is to uncover, help, give people control over their perspectives and their insights. So this is about working with, or even taking the lead from, disabled insights, not assuming it's up to us to kind of fix this. And I think the point you made about ableism is really interesting, because I'm going to ask Josh. That sounds like a tricky question for Josh, but I think people talk about ableism and disableism. They don't necessarily know the difference between the two. But ableism is where you discriminate against disabled people in favor of non-disabled people. And the truth I'm going to call out is that most brand experiences and advertisements do exactly this. It's always a case of prioritizing the needs of non-disabled people, and that's what we're trying to change. So, Josh, does any of this sound familiar? We're obviously talking from a UK perspective, but tell me how it is in the US.
No, this all sounds extremely familiar, Marianne. And if I need to repeat myself or anything, please let me know. Hopefully, the miles apart are easily connected, and everyone can hear me just fine. But definitely here in the U.S., just considering globally as well, disability is still a bit secondary. It's both perceived societally secondarily from the majority of society, and in advertising as well. And the opportunity, though, of course, as you know, from the Purple Pound initiative in the United Kingdom, that people with disabilities have dollars to spend. They're brand loyal. There are many ways to welcome people with disability. My consideration, though, is that here in America, disability is still not recognized as a viable consumer base. Or more importantly, in advertising, hopefully we celebrate icons and iconoclasts. And people with disabilities are both of those, right? I would hope me as a blind person can bring ideas just like anybody else, that I can bring disabled ideas that are good, that we can have Black ideas, we can have Latinx ideas, that being disabled doesn't make me less than. But still today, we're at a place where we need to move forward in the journey, and we're not there yet.
No, not quite there yet. And I think to that point, thinking about the needs of this market in particular, as someone that has worked in inclusive design for the last few years, it's very interesting to qualify initiatives for disability around this idea that if you do it for disabled people, you'll make it better for everyone, which is brilliant and an excellent kind of byproduct. But I think actually, given that globally, when you include friends and family, this is a market worth $13 trillion, it's worth actually meeting the needs of disabled people in and of themselves. And to that point, in the UK, there was a brilliant report that came out both in 2016 and in 2019 called the Click Away Pound Survey. It was a survey done by Freeney Williams, and what they wanted to do was estimate how much money businesses were losing out on when it came to online experiences and websites in particular. And they found that in 2019, in the UK alone, business was losing out on £17.1 billion worth of revenue. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of web accessibility, because you might think that's slightly separate to advertising, but actually thinking about this systemic problem and the fact that if you can't get the right talent within your organization, you can't change things. This is a huge issue when you think about, disabled people can't apply for jobs, they can't feedback on experiences, so we can't change things. And so to kind of highlight this issue, the Advertising Association did a quick audit on their council members' websites, so over 40 businesses that span the entire advertising industry landscape. They were all audited by a specialist consultancy, and they found that none of them passed the international standards of usability and accessibility. So, Josh, you have written at length about the importance of web accessibility. What kind of advice could you give to council members and other organisations who want to evolve and improve their offerings?
Yeah, so I'll go through 5 points very briefly, but the first is move from compliance to really commitments. Don't let the fear of legalities or litigation come in the way of welcoming people with disability online. Here in the US, there are tens, if not thousands, of lawsuits regularly and repeatedly. And it's not to say that those lawsuits are not justified, but brands, businesses, advertising agencies need to welcome disability from a compliance, not from a compliance standpoint, but rather from a commitment standpoint, so that they're more ingrained to welcoming people with disability because of their brand loyalty, because of the value that they can bring, as opposed to these fears of litigation. Secondly, elevate, don't relegate. So sometimes when it comes to welcoming people with disabilities on websites, we only think from a technological standpoint, coding and programming. And yes, definitely alt tags are important for videos and images. And we need everything from audio descriptions to captioning to ensure that the website is as accessible as possible. But we need to welcome disability from a content standpoint, so that it's not just on a single page for accessibility statements, but rather that disability can be ingrained throughout a website. Third, I'd like to say that what we need to do is also consider omnichannel communications. Marianne, you just said that websites really might be a bit secondary to advertising, but in fact, they're the front door digitally of so many brands, if not all the brands out there anymore. But there is communications that guides people to websites. And so if, yes, you have an accessible website, but your other communications in no way welcomes disability, then how are you going to get those hopefully loyal consumers with disabilities to connect to your website? Another consideration is that there's been a lot of talk and a lot of investment in what are called overlays or widgets that allow websites to kind of check a box and say, yes, now that I have this accessibility widget on my website's accessible. But that, to an extent, circumvents the design process. And it really kind of bolts on disability after the fact, as opposed to moving more upstream in a creative process where designers, programmers, creatives can all come together at the beginning of developing a website, or as you continue to update a website, to say, how can we make this website more accessible? How can we make it inclusive? How can we welcome people with disabilities? Don't just check that box and get that annual subscription for that widget. It's a great bridge, but there's still going to be gaps in welcoming disability if that's the only consideration. And finally, the fifth point to share is that education is critical. This is a professional organization in the United Kingdom, of course, that this event is a part of, but it's so critical to ensure that at the university level, we're welcoming young people with disabilities to get excited about developing websites, producing advertising, becoming anything and everything within an ad agency, as well as being a talent on screen. So looking at welcoming young people with disabilities and training from an allyship standpoint, young people to come into the industry to get excited and start to have some answers when it comes to either websites or any other part of inclusive design for people with disabilities in communications.
Fab, thank you so much. And so, Mike, Do you have a view on any examples of companies who are getting it right across any of those points, or any companies that you think can be kind of heralded as those that are winning in this area?
So I think IKEA are a good example. I think IKEA are just a good brand because they've got design at their heart. But they recently did a case study in Israel called Disables, and that was designing furniture, kind of household items for disabled people, and they actually involved a guy with cerebral palsy, and so they designed a whole range of furniture that was more accessible for him. So, for example, he struggled to get off a normal height couch, so they designed a lower couch, which made it easier for him to get up. So I think that's a very good example of a brand really designing for disabled people in mind. Another famous example, of course, is Nike, and they designed a whole range of running shoes for people that find it difficult to tie laces. I guess that is a good example where it is designed for disabled people, but it also helps people that might have disability later in life or poor hand dexterity due to Parkinson's. So I think it's a good example of designing for everyone in mind. I can safely say that I've got a pair myself, and that they're damn comfortable. And I think what is important to bear in mind in the IKEA example and another example is that, if you'll excuse my language, when it comes to accessible design, lots of it looks crap or beige, because they basically think, oh, they're disabled, they don't really care. But what's good about the IKEA and that examples is that they actually look good, and they actually look like stuff that you want to have in your house, or you want to wear, and you want to share off your mates. So I think that's another good point to make, is that just because it's inclusive doesn't mean aesthetic isn't important to think about.
I love it. Thank you so much for making that point, because this kind of historical tension between form and function, and, you know, things that were created for disability usually look like they've come out of an NHS showroom or the early learning centre. And so we're now starting to see what we at Interbrand call the design divide breaking down. And that's what happens when you marry kind of mainstream creative and you know, brand aesthetic with that kind of more functional need. And I think that's what's so exciting about how we can break it down through advertising as well, because Sam, we can probably talk for hours on the kind of the unhelpful tropes that we see through advertising, but I think it's only recently brands have started to kind of realize, oh, this isn't about charity. Oh, okay, this is actually about serving the needs of a market and serving people for longer as we age and slowly become less able. So aside from charity and inspiration porn, what other unhelpful tropes or pitfalls would you ask the advertising world to avoid?
Gosh, so don't be scared to use the word disability. I don't know whether it was the Nike shoes, but there was some controversy over that they didn't actually want to say that this was specifically predominantly for people with dexterity issues or a variety of different disabilities. And I think that was a bit like, it isn't a dirty word, will make us feel ashamed out of it. It's a little bit like, so over in the UK, all black taxis, so they're the London cabs, they're called black cabs, have to by law have accessibility features. And for me as a full-time wheelchair user, that means they all have ramps, which is like, hurrah, great, because I can't get on public transport independently, because it can be a little bit hit and miss at times, or just completely inaccessible. So I rely heavily on these accessible taxis, but I'm often reminded by the taxi drivers that they are the only ones that have got this ramp, and aren't they great? And I feel really, really, grateful that they are the ones with these ramps in comparison with other companies. And I'm like, oh, hang on a minute, am I not are you driving me around for free? Am I not paying for your service? So I think it's this whole thing of don't make disabled people feel grateful for access, because access is a basic human right, and we are contributing towards society. We are integral members of society. We might see the world differently, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think, everyone here knows that success comes from thinking outside the box. And that is definitely an attribute that disabled people, acquire over time because they have to. But I think, for me, as someone who struggles with mental health concerns, anxiety, and also physical disability, I've got brittle bones, so I can break bones on a regular basis. I have just employed a new PA. I've luckily received some more PA, so personal assistant. I prefer the term rather than carer. So language is obviously important, and just ask us what language we prefer. But, I've only recently received a few more hours for assistance. But what I was finding, it's that just the lack of sympathy and the lack of knowledge what it's like to have a disability day to day. So, I'd be getting ready, booked my PA to come and assist me, and then it'd be like, oh no, we're not doing that today anymore, we're doing it tomorrow. And maybe I don't have a PA tomorrow, or maybe that means I'll have to find me to pay for a PA, or maybe I take longer in the morning because I'm in pain, or maybe there's so many just little day-to-day things that I think people just don't take for granted. I did a photo shoot not that long back, and there was another lovely lady there who was who used a crutch, and we were waiting around, stood there waiting for the picture to be taken. I'm like, would you like a chair? And everyone was just mulling around. It's like these little things, just the little tiny tokens of, okay, really, she shouldn't be stood there for half an hour while you kind of see where you want to position the camera. So I think it is just actively recognizing that you are ignorant. If you're non-disabled, you are ignorant towards disability. That isn't me giving you a hard time, but that's just the truth, And I was ignorant to a lot of things before I became, like the Black Lives Matter movement. I was definitely ignorant to a lot of things before that showed me my privilege. So I think we need to recognize that, we need to invest and do a bit of groundwork and communicate and reach out to disabled people to see what would actually benefit them. I think COVID has been a blessing for many people, and I don't say that in any disrespect, in the sense that, we're doing this virtually. For me, this is a godsend that I can do this virtually. I don't have to worry about being in pain. I don't have to worry about anxiety. I can do everything from the comfort of my home. I don't have to worry about a PA coming with me. I don't have to worry about inaccessible public transport. So I think moving forward, learn from what we've witnessed in the pandemic, offer things like virtual gatherings, but also don't kind of use that as an excuse not to become more inclusive. I think one of my fears is moving forward, when we go back to normality, quote unquote, is that people are going to go, well, you're disabled, we don't need to make access needs because you can just do it online now. When actually, sometimes I want to be there front row at a concert. I want to be there in the mix with people. I want to be getting drunk with my friends. I want to be part of the team, But then it's also great to know that if I'm not up to it, I can then go, do you know what, guys? Have a fab time, but I'd love to do this virtually or on the phone.
I think that's a good point, though, around I was just going to say about kind of autonomy and choice, because quite often it's like there's the normal non-disabled solution, and then there's like an able alternative that's very limited and restricted and usually segregated. So this kind of idea of autonomy and choice and control is something that I think people are still slowly getting their head around. I think on that point, you mentioned this actually, the euphemisms, like this idea that disability is not a dirty word. Lots of people are very proud to use this as an identifier. But we hear a lot of people kind of go down the road of using the words differently abled or diffability, which kind of are seen very much as erasive terms because you're, saying that it's uncomfortable, or, we're saying that disability is less than. And that would be my wish, I think, for the advertising industry, is to kind of really get to grips with that use of language. Josh, what would be your wish? What advice do you have for the advertising industry if you were going to give them one piece of advice?
Well, so recently, since the Black Lives Matter movement was just brought up, so many agencies, so many brands have recognized the value of having a chief diversity officer or somebody focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's valuable. But Marianne, I would look to you and your title, Inclusive Design Strategist, Specialist, lead, that if we look at the size of the disability community, massive. 1 in 4 Americans, 1 in 5 globally has a disability. And it's something potentially that we all may be a part of as we continue to age. And so knowing that, I would suggest that all brands, that all agencies need to have an inclusive design team member that can focus on this, that can be a voice, that can bring in people from the disability community. And so professionally, we need more of you, Marianne, across a variety of agencies and brands. And then the second point, we need more people with disability in the industry. And again, that starts at the university level. How can we start to develop courses or work that guides young people into the industry that have disabilities, or again, create that allyship with people who are not disabled?
I think that's the thing, Josh. It's not rocket science. Do you know what I mean? Just hire, work, listen to, work with people with these perspectives. And the talent pipeline is such an important one. There are lots of things that the advertising industry, I think, can do, to your point, around kind of supporting young people through university, college, thinking about what they can do through internships to help improve that pipeline. Mike, one piece of advice, one wish, one thought?
One bit of advice. I think this is empathy. I think we talked about a lot about the pipeline and getting more people in. I think that's true, but I think a lot of advertisers' job and my job as a strategist is to think about people and how other people behave. Like a lot of brands that I work on, I don't have any personal experience of. So I would say that obviously lived experience is important, but everyone can think about this and everyone can join in and come up with strategies that help build a more inclusive world.
Love it, thank you. And Sam, your one ask or piece of advice?
Oh my goodness. Just leave your ego at the door. And recognise that you don't know everything, even if you've heard of the social model of disability, or even if you feel comfortable using the word disability, it doesn't mean that you know what it can speak for us. And I think, I would not say empathy, but I would say sympathy, and I think there's a difference between empathy and sympathy, and I think you need to get your head around that ultimately. And, it's very, very simple things for me, and we talked about websites. I've just got my official website now, and if you click onto it, SamanthaRenkeOfficial.com, that there's one button with the universal disability sign. You click on it, and there's everything there for everybody so that you can access it. I am a technophobe, and I managed to do that. So it's so simple, and I think disabled people aren't unrealistic. When you're talking about 1 in 5 people, you're always going to get the extreme version. Not everyone wants to advocate, and then you've got people that are, want things done today, and that's not necessarily always helpful. But what I would say is recognize that we are there, and that might just be simple things like making sure your website's kind of up to scratch, or brands, what are you doing for Disability History Month? Do you even know when Disability History Month? Did you even know it existed? So it's just that little nod that, okay, we might not get it right all the time, but we recognize that you are there and we value your consumer contribution. We know we're hearing you, and we are trying to work towards fostering a better inclusive environment. And I think that for me is more than going, oh, well, we're not doing enough, and panicking and not doing anything at all. Just that little nod that we feel that we're acknowledged. I think that's all we ask for.
Acknowledged and listened to, yeah, absolutely. And actually, Mike said something recently, I think that was incredibly helpful, is I think at the moment, there are brands that kind of think they're going to do a thing. We're going to invest in a, disabled or inclusive thing, and then we've ticked that box, or we've kind of, found that solution. And actually, this isn't about kind of arriving at a destination, as it were. This isn't about kind of getting to a point where it's solved. Especially, again, I was learning last week about kind of website accessibility, and that, where you meet certain standards one week, if things don't evolve, or if you don't continue to invest in removing barriers, you will slowly kind of potentially become inaccessible. So really, inclusivity, or that journey, is kind of a continuum. This sounds awful, but it's like a journey of awakening and ongoing action, as opposed to kind of getting to an endpoint. And clearly there's so much work to do in this area. But you led into, Mike, were you going to say something?
Oh, just very quickly, I think there's a very good point to make, Marianne. Look, if I was an idealist, this could all happen overnight, and we could all be on the beach having a beer. But sadly, life doesn't work like that. And inclusive design is a journey. There will be pain points. There will be difficulties. So I think that's what's changed in my thinking quite a bit. That not to be too pessimistic, but it will never be over. There will always be improvements, and that's actually, when you think about it like that, that's actually quite liberating. That there will always be work to be done. There will always be jobs that will need to be done. And so I think actually that's quite a positive way of thinking about it, rather than thinking about it as in, tomorrow the world will be fully inclusive, because maybe I'm a cynic, but that's sadly just a pipe dream that won't exist.
Thank you so much, guys. And a seamless segue there from Sam into actions that we can take within the industry. So clearly there's a lot of work to do, but a vital first step, and this would be the first of many steps, like we say, it's an ongoing journey, but the first thing we would urge industry stakeholders to do is to audit their company websites to ensure that they are working to meet international standards of usability and accessibility. So if you visit the Advertising Association's All In Hub, you'll be able to access resources to help you do this. But for now, I'm so grateful to our wonderful panelists, and I'd like to thank each of you. Thank you so much, Josh Loebner, Sam Renke, Mike Alhadeff, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much, everyone.